In the winding, candlelit corridors of history, there have always walked those with so much money they could no longer tell the difference between want and whim. People for whom hunger was never anything more than flavor-based boredom, and whose greatest burden was choosing between four near-identical palaces, or whether the peacocks should wear tiny satin slippers during Wednesday garden strolls to reduce the clacking sounds. Seriously. And tonight, we begin our gentle drift through the whispering tapestries of these financially overachieving eccentrics, not with fanfare, but with porridge. Endless porridge, which brings us in a billow of starch and strawberry jam to one of Europe's most extravagantly bland moments, breakfast in 18th century England. You see, when money stopped mattering to the aristocrats, they began spending it not just to eat, but to out-eat one another in the most absurd, socially competitive ways. And so, breakfast, what had once been a humble start to the day, turned into a parade of golden toast racks, imported Delft porridge bowls, and a silver spoon for each individual berry. At the head of this breakfast revolution stood Lady Elizabeth Montagu, who, despite sounding like someone who might invent evening gloves for parrots, and honestly, probably did, was more concerned with her morning dining arrangements. She is best remembered today for hosting enormous blue stocking salons filled with literary brilliance and men in emotionally supportive waistcoats. But what fewer people know is that she also installed a porridge servant. Yes, a man, for porridge. His full-time role was the ceremonial stirring, temperature checking, and philosophical supervision of oats, prepared and served with such gravity you'd think it were a small opera, rather than a breakfast. The porridge servant did not speak. He merely ladled, solemnly. Lady Montagu's breakfast spread was so sacred that guests would show up an hour early, just to observe it being set, like watching monks light votive oatmeal candles, which would have been funny if it weren't also stunningly expensive. The rare berries alone, shipped in by horse-drawn miracles from regions that had barely heard of breakfast, could have bought you a working mill, or a very polite cow. But if porridge servants sound indulgent, allow me to gently stroll you over to Versailles. Yes, that Versailles, with the mirrors, the wigs, and the chronic overuse of powdered anything. While Louis XIV was known for calling himself the Sun King, I suspect in private he may have also called himself the Purchase Everything King. He didn't merely buy things, he commissioned the absurd. When money didn't matter anymore, the French court turned purchases into performances. Take, for instance, the aperitif automatons. These were delicate, gilded mechanical birds that served drinks. Each tiny, flapping metal songbird would glide down a miniature golden track, like a very judgmental parrot airline, carrying thimble-sized aperitifs to seated guests in the orangery gardens. They never sang, only beeped faintly and carried tiny glasses, like a robotic apology for being decorative. How much did they cost? No one knows, which is always a sign someone paid too much. But the courtiers adored them, clapping softly for each serving bird, as one might for a mildly talented nephew. No one needed these birds. But that, my dear listener, was precisely the point. When money ceases to function as currency and starts acting more like a love letter to your own absurdity, you get cocktail birds. Even the servants got swept up in the gilded madness. Records survive of stable boys wearing custom silk-lined boots. For the horses, by every written account, didn't seem especially impressed. And so, you see, when wealth becomes weightless and money begins to float away, like a feather on a sleepy breeze, people don't stop spending. They just start spending, sideways. On porridge men, on automaton avians, on evening lemon-scented gloves for a dog that doesn't like gloves. And that is precisely the kind of sleepy, baffling nonsense that history gives us in abundance. So as you lie there, comfortable where you are, picture the slow stir of silver in porcelain, the automaton bird gliding across a garden table, and just maybe a horse looking unimpressed in velvet socks it didn't ask for. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest your eyes and let's ever so gently drift toward the next curious corner of opulence. By the late 17th century, once you'd had enough gold to make your bed frame out of it, and possibly your chamber pot too, the next logical luxury wasn't another castle or an extra duchy. No, the truly creative, certifiably over-the-top rich turned their fortunes towards something even more expensive than armies of servants or fleets of carriages: time. Or more specifically, clocks. Not just any clocks, of course. These were not the wooden tickers Aunt Mildred kept on the shelf. These weren't even grandfather clocks. Not unless your grandfather was Louis XIV and your grandmother was a Swiss horologist. These timepieces were glittering, gear-laden, precision-powered status monoliths, often incapable of actually telling the right time, but very capable of telling everyone how wealthy and deeply unnecessary you were. Take, for instance, Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, and owner of forearms so mighty he could crack horseshoes with a leisurely twist. A man like that needed a clock that could hold its own in both brawn and drama. Augustus collected clocks the way some people collect postcards, except each clock cost roughly as much as a minor duchy and had names like the Singing Peacock or the Celestial Time Narrator. His Dresden collection eventually grew into over 200 ornately jeweled, musically orchestrating gold-throated devices that chimed, spun, and did everything short of making tea. One had dancing figurines that waltzed on the hour. Another had doors that opened to reveal a tiny brass orchestra which played something approximating a Handel fugue if Handel had been underwater and mildly drunk. The purpose? Well, you already had time. You could just look at the sun or ask a peasant. But these clocks were not there to be witnessed. Operatic mechanical performances wrapped in sapphires gliding in to remind you, and your noble acquaintances, just how leisurely your life had become. If you had time to kill watching a golden miniature play the lute while a cherub rotated in circles behind him, well, you were winning. Now let's sidle over to France, where Louis XV, bless his powdered soul, took horological one-upmanship to Baroque heights. At his court, clocks weren't just luxurious. They became vessels of flattery. One particularly magnificent piece, known as the Passementerie clock, was designed specifically to please Madame de Pompadour, his elusive, well-read mistress and art enthusiast. It reportedly had a scene of her reading a book. Yes, a tiny mechanical version of her, deep in thought, turning faux parchment pages in rhythm with ticking hours. The message was clear. My affection for you is so lavish, I've imprisoned you, elegantly, inside a time machine. And how she swooned. Probably. Meanwhile, in England, a Mr. John Harrison dedicated decades of his life and a small mountain of royal sponsorship money to solving the longitude problem. That is, helping ships figure out precisely where they were, long before GPS, and long after guessing had gotten many of them thoroughly misplaced. His marine chronometers, exquisitely accurate timekeepers, designed to survive ocean turbulence and imperial ambition, were made of arcane woods and temperature-sensitive springs, all polished so finely they could blind a sailor at high noon. They were absurdly expensive to construct, but even more expensive to trust, since early models could be finicky. Still, for the wealthiest empire of the day, no cost was too great to prevent sailors from inadvertently conquering the wrong coastline. In a way, this obsession with extravagant timepieces was exquisitely ironic. The mega-rich, by very definition, lived without schedules. Clocks, for them, weren't about catching the carriage or serving tea by 4. They were trophies, humming monuments to the delicious fact that if they were late, it simply didn't matter. And so, in drawing rooms lit by fluttering candlelight and the glint of too much gold leaf, the sort of person who'd never wound a pocket watch in earnest would press the button on a miniature mechanical orrery and watch the little metal planets orbit the sun. They didn't need to know what time it was. They needed only to know that time belonged to them. Now, with the clocks softly ticking in gilded salons, let's drift gently from Europe's time-obsessed elite to a place where wealth sought something even more curious, a way to bring nature, tamed and trimmed, right into one's own parlor. If the year is 1519 and you're the kind of person who adds a second golden fork to your golden dessert fork, just in case the strawberries commit a fashion faux pas, then congratulations, you might be Emperor Charles V, born into a tangled knot of Habsburg ambition and Renaissance opulence. Charles was one of those rare humans who inherited more land than most people can correctly identify on a globe. Spain, the Netherlands, large chunks of Italy, some awkwardly useful territories in the New World, and, of course, the Holy Roman Empire. Because what's world domination without some holy flair? Now, when you're emperor of basically everything west of your breakfast table, you could spend your wealth on something sensible like infrastructure or education. But where's the glamour in that? Charles V opted for the holy grail of rich guy priorities during the Renaissance, collecting jaw-droppingly intricate mechanical table centerpieces shaped like ships, dragons, and occasionally entire miniature performances of mythological stories powered by winding mechanisms. Imagine your dining room being interrupted by a 16-inch metallic Pegasus trotting across the table, rearing up with a clang, and spitting out almond-dusted marzipan balls. That's the mood Charles was chasing. It turns out, rich folks in the 16th century were way into surprises. And no, not surprise parties. Those were a bit too risky when everyone was armed with swords and unresolved feuds. These were more like surprise automata. Tiny machines of clockwork artistry, handcrafted by silently suffering artisans who had likely sworn off springs and gears in their dreams. One particularly ludicrous example, widely believed to have been associated with Charles, was a table fountain that not only poured spiced wine, but also played music through hydraulically powered organ pipes, while little golden birds bobbed along in synchronized choreography. All of this, presumably, happening while dinner guests tried to politely stab at an elusive olive. Being rich wasn't just about what you could buy. It was about what you could confuse people into thinking you needed. Take, for instance, Charles's eye-wateringly elaborate robe made with gold thread and dyed mink fur, which was so heavy it required 2 attendants to help him remove it. Not for style, just so he didn't dislocate a shoulder mid-toast. Royal tailors, often with the patience of saints and fingers permanently pinched by embroidery needles, had the daunting job of keeping their clients cloaked in prestige. Literal cloaks, yes, but also garments that doubled as propaganda pieces. Imagine a cape emblazoned with celestial bodies, engineered to shimmer like the night sky when under candlelight, and naturally, only visible to those standing within fawning distance. Fashion, in those days, was both a flex and a foreign policy statement. And the jewels. Oh, the jewels. Let us tiptoe gently now into the realm of ridiculous gemstones. Charles owned a ruby so large and so intimidatingly shiny that it was stored in a carved velvet chest within a box, within a chest, within a chamber that required 2 keys, 3 guards, and 1 discreet astrologer to access. Was the astrologer necessary? Maybe not. But everything in that era was somehow improved by the suggestion of star charts. More revealing, perhaps, was the way Charles V handled boredom, which is something money can't really solve. But spend enough, and you can smother it in spectacle. He commissioned court masks so magnificent and so deeply allegorical that half of Europe's nobility spent decades nodding sagely at things they did not understand. Imagine sitting through a performance where a costumed Mercury fights a triumphant harvest spirit, all while speaking in verse, with hidden fountains spouting wine as symbolic doves flap overhead. You clap, unsure if you're supporting peace, the monarchy, or an especially dramatic wine vintage. And through all of this, the mechanical marvels, the luxury fabrics, the henchmen with keys stuffed into matching leather satchels, There is a sense that the truly rich of the past were engaged in an ongoing competition, not to outspend each other, but to outwonder each other, to build a life so bafflingly theatrical that even their enemies fell into baffled admiration. But eventually, even Charles V, burdened by velvet, rubies, and planetary alignment diagrams, gave it all up for a monastery and some solitude. Turns out when money truly doesn't matter, what you might crave most is a little quiet. And yet, even within the hush of retreat, some elite tastes never faded. Because while the world downshifted towards simplicity, someone, somewhere, was still commissioning a 6-foot silver pineapple stand. But we'll knock gently on that gilded door. Next, it was a Wednesday, widely believed to be the most dependable day of the week, when Ludwig II of Bavaria decided that gravity, financial or otherwise, did not apply to him. He wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, in his glitter-drenched world, gravity was more of a polite suggestion than anything strictly enforceable. Bavarian nobles called him the fairy tale king, though you'd hardly find any fairies who could afford the kind of fairy tale Ludwig was living. In the years following his accidental stumble into power at age 18, and let's be honest, no one is really ready to govern a kingdom before they can legally rent a carriage, the young monarch dove headfirst into the most luxurious form of historical fan fiction imaginable. He had absolutely no desire to govern his realm. Meetings bored him, laws confused him, and the idea of sitting through a budget discussion was probably enough to send him sprinting into the Alps in a cape. So instead, he spent his inheritance and Bavaria's borrowed fortunes on building castles. Not just some castles, very specific castles. Castles that paid tribute to his dramatic idol and spiritual man-crush, Richard Wagner, the operatic titan of German Romanticism. Ludwig was so taken by Wagner's bombastic music and Nordic plotlines of cursed love and magical swans that he practically lived inside their dramatic crescendos. The king even built a personal opera house just for Wagner, because that's what true fans with deep pockets do. They sponsor entire buildings for their favorite artists. His pièce de résistance was undoubtedly Neuschwanstein Castle, perched on a jagged cliff with the kind of scenic view that makes postcards jealous. This wasn't a humble medieval fortress for defense. It was a stone and marble monument to myth, echoing with imaginary knights, shimmering mosaics, theatrical murals, and enough gilding to blind a goose. It had a throne room with no throne because Ludwig couldn't decide what it would look like, and a fake cave. Yes, a cave indoors, with stalactites, for ambience. But perhaps, more than anything, Ludwig's obsession wasn't with grandeur, it was with escape. Every spire, every gilded eagle and velvet sofa was a rebellion against reality. And the bills. Oh, the bills. Bavaria didn't have a treasury so much as a hemorrhage with ledger paper. Ludwig's ministers were deeply concerned, not out of any sense of adulting per se, but because even 19th century European powers had a vague sense that financially ruinous cosplay wasn't a long-term economic strategy. Still, Ludwig didn't care. He rarely slept regularly, dined alone, and preferred his nights wandering candlelit halls lined with silk and longing. He communicated with courtiers by letter, even when they were in the next room. When his debts turned from fanciful to catastrophic, he requested more loans instead of slowing the construction of, yes, a second mountaintop fantasy castle. It was as if Ludwig believed beauty itself could replace governance. And in a way, he was right. Neuschwanstein went on to inspire Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle. If you're going to hemorrhage a treasury, you might as well create the world's most iconic silhouette in the process. Of course, Ludwig's dream couldn't last. Governments are notoriously impatient when the monarch starts installing indoor lagoons. Eventually, the same ministers who once humored his operatic detours declared him mentally unfit. There wasn't a psychiatric evaluation involved, just a bit of paperwork, a few concerned nods, and suddenly, the king was mad enough to be dethroned. What happened next is the sort of mystery that seems tailor-made for suspenseful novels and long autumn walks with whispered conspiracies. Ludwig was relocated to a remote castle under guard. 2 days later, he was found floating in a shallow lake alongside the very doctor who had pronounced him insane. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but unofficially, history has never quite agreed. But that's the funny bit about people who try to buy magic with money. They often disappeared into the stories they created. Ludwig left behind more than scandal and unpaid invoices. He gave the world the architectural equivalent of wistful memory. Neuschwanstein remains today, eternally under scaffolding, as all truly ambitious dreams are. And as the night settles softly, we wander now from misty Bavaria to the strangest landowners of all. Not princes, not bankers, but the Victorian collectors who spent fortunes on teeth, ivory, bones and bottled oddities await in what can only be described as aristocratic hoarding with an academic alibi. When the Yoi sunset over the grand salons of 18th century Europe, where powdered wigs reigned supreme and tea was considered an acceptable substitute for water, one could usually count on two things. Someone, somewhere, was playing a harpsichord far too enthusiastically, and someone else was spending an incomprehensible fortune on something completely unnecessary. Let us drift now to the manicured gardens of Versailles, that baroque blaze of symmetry where the grass was trimmed so neatly you'd swear the earth was trying to impress God. There, among the mirrored halls and perfumed rendezvous, we find Louis XVI, lover of locks, clocks, and confusion. Though history tends to paint him as a man preoccupied with beheadings, namely his own, in quieter days, King Louis's world revolved around the elaborate machinery of padlocks. Yes, lock collecting was his thing. The man adored mechanical puzzles. Not your ordinary keep your diary safe from younger sibling locks, but ornate contraptions forged by artisans who charged more for a key than most people made in a year. Louis commissioned safes, cabinets, and trick-opening doors so complex that even he occasionally forgot how to open them. Nothing declared one's wealth more subtly than not knowing how to access one's own valuables. But Louis was far from alone in his extravagant mechanical fascinations. You see, when one is so rich that the phrase, "spare no expense," becomes not a phrase but a lifestyle, a curious thing happens. You stop buying things for their usefulness and begin buying things simply because they move in a pleasing little circle. Enter the world of automata, little self-operating machines that could replicate birdsongs, write tiny poems, or pour an imaginary cup of tea with robotic grace. These were the iPhones of the Enlightenment, except they didn't make calls, they made conversation. Swiss watchmakers, especially in Geneva, made fortunes creating these gilded gadget creatures. One famous creation was the Writer, a charming doll-like machine built by Swiss master Pierre-Jacques Droz around 1770, capable of writing over 40 custom characters with an actual quill. You could program it, yes, program it, to scribble your name in calligraphy, all by turning a few cams the way you might tune a sleepy music box. Buying something like that screamed, "I want to tell the world I am an intellectual, but I would rather not speak." And then there was the peacock clock, commissioned by Catherine the Great in Russia from an English automaton maker named James Cox. Imagine, if you will, a life-sized mechanical peacock that, at the turn of a key, would open its tail feathers, flap its wings and rotate its head. It functioned primarily as a clock, secondarily as a bird, and mostly as a not-so-subtle reminder that the Empress could afford a metal pet more elegant than your actual living one. Catherine had it shipped from England in pieces, because shipping a life-size mechanical peacock across 18th century Europe was just one of those things you did when the Russian economy lived in your handbag. But not all luxury automata were birds and poets. In the court of the Qianlong Emperor in 18th century China, the ultimate mark of opulent taste came packaged in tiny musical snuff boxes. These were portable clouds of extravagance, tiny metallic boxes that could sing like birds when opened. Actual avian chirps from a miniature mechanical whistle, all tucked inside what was essentially the size of a sardine tin. One noble is even said to have entered a banquet late, cracked open his snuff box, and silenced an entire room with the dainty song of synthetic birdsong. Because in a world where everyone's wearing robes woven from gold thread, sometimes you need an auto-chirper just to stand out. And while bird songs and peacocks might seem frivolous, there was a philosophy to it all, a dreamy logic that wired together wealth, nature, and the marvel of human hands. If money was no object, then why not buy wonder itself? Why not own something that told time and told a story? Tonight, we floated through a world where the wealthy bought movement for magic's sake. But in another place, a little farther west, and a few decades later, the rich would start buying one other impossible thing: silence. Lavender-scented, leather-bound, and lined with whispering pages. A world not of machines or songbirds, but of books unread by the very people who shelved them, by the hundred. And there, in their grand, paper-scented libraries, we'll gently turn the next page, when the 17th century French aristocrat Henrietta de Lorraine-Lillebonne wanted to make a statement. She didn't commission a portrait or throw a lavish ball. She commissioned an entire garden, shaped like her own monogram. Now imagine that. Having a garden shaped like your initials just in case the heavens grant you one last hot air balloon ride and you want to look down and think, "Ah, yes, that is indeed my hedge." You see, when money no longer demanded restraint, the fabulously wealthy turned to their truest love: vanity horticulture. Landscape architecture became less about pleasing nature and more about bossing it around. Symmetry was compulsory, fountains were mandatory, and nothing, not even the natural course of hills, could resist the mighty will of a manicured elite. The grand slam of this leafy egoism was, of course, Versailles. The palace gets all the fame, but the gardens? That's where the unchecked decadence bloomed most extravagantly. Louis XIV didn't just expand the gardens of Versailles. He declared a full-blown horticultural mutiny on the wilderness. He commissioned gardener André Le Nôtre to tame the earth into submission. And tame it he did. The orangery, yes, an entire indoor habitat for citrus trees, was a kind of citrus safe house during the chilly months. Dozens of gardeners were employed not to harvest the oranges, but to wheel them in and out daily like tiny royal debutantes preparing for their seasonal debut. It took hours, every day. For fruit no one really intended to eat. Because wealth, when stretched far enough, circles back around and becomes performance art. Not to be outdone on the other side of Europe, the Russian aristocracy sought frostier ways to outspend boredom. Empress Elizabeth of Russia once hosted a banquet in one of her palaces, wherein every dish, spoon, and wall sconce was entirely made of sugar. No, not dusted with, not glazed in, comprised of. Entire chandeliers were sculpted from sugar and lit with beeswax candles, which is an elegant way of saying the whole thing was a sticky fire hazard. The sugar banquet was the imperial version of that time you tried to bake a giant gingerbread house, but ended up with a vaguely rectangular pile of frosting-glued regret. Except instead of a kitchen counter, it took place in a ballroom the size of a village. You might be wondering, weren't there wars, famine, revolt? And yes, somewhere out there, the winds of history blew strong. But behind velvet curtains, when wealth reached its final form, it transcended earthly logic. The rich became part alchemist, part stage director, spending fortunes to suspend reality. Take, for example, George IV of England, before he was king, back when he was still known as the Prince Regent. George designed an entire seaside palace, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, in an over-the-top Indo-Chinese style. Think onion domes, dragon chandeliers, and napkins folded so diagnostically into lotus shapes you expected them to speak wisdom. British taxpayers helped fund it, of course, whether or not they had any personal interest in elephant-shaped teapots. But perhaps the finest flower in this bouquet of absurdity was the invention of ephemeral architecture, structures built to impress, then destroyed. Why keep a folly forever when you can burn it for applause? Catherine the Great funded an entire ice palace during a particularly harsh winter in 1739. It had ice furniture, an ice wedding chapel, and even ice cannons that fired ice cannonballs. It lasted only until the spring thaw naturally, at which point it became history's most opulent puddle. This peculiar desire to construct the impermanent, only to melt, topple, or crumble for no better reason than timing, was not about utility. It was about declaring, "Look what I can do with nothing. Imagine what I could do with something." And so, the truly rich flirted with ephemerality like bored Greek gods on holiday. They built to unbuild, spent to unspend. When the economy was irrelevant and gravity was optional, the garden paths twisted like script. The sugar chandeliers dripped silently, and cannons made entirely of ice saluted absolutely nothing at all. Which brings us, quite naturally, to the curious matter of the most expensive hat collection in Enlightenment Europe and the scandalous auction in which powdered wigs were briefly worth more than a fleet of merchant ships. There is rich, and then there's early modern Italian merchant who names his dog after a Pope rich. In the 15th century, Florence was no stranger to flaunting. Wealthy merchant families with names like Medici and Strozzi, which sound less like surnames and more like expensive cheeses, had moved well beyond owning nice shoes and were now in the business of commissioning entire allegories. Not paintings of people, mind you. Allegories. You know, abstract concepts like justice and prudence, lovingly painted onto the living room wall next to the fireplace. Because what's better than sipping Chianti under a 9-foot-high fresco of moderation, looking a bit judgy as you pour your fourth goblet? The Medici family, a household name in both Renaissance banking and the art of how to humble brag via architecture, had a particularly subtle way of broadcasting wealth. Cosimo de' Medici, the family patriarch, famously said, "I can do what I want, as long as it doesn't look like I'm doing what I want." This may be the origin of humble luxury, a vibe also known as Renaissance stealth wealth. This philosophy resulted in palaces with stone exteriors that tried to look tough and modest, but inside was an entirely different scroll of parchment. Walls covered in gold-leafed narrative cycles, ceilings painted with mythological origin stories of nobody's real ancestors, and entire rooms designed for the sole purpose of impressing one visiting noble from Naples. Sometimes they'd commission art not just of saints or ancestors, but of themselves as saints or ancestors. Subtlety, thy name is not Giovanni, but let us now peek, gently, into the stateroom of one particularly extravagant item, a salt cellar. Yes, salt, that magical mineral that made meat less gruesome and turned bland stews into something approaching soup. By the Renaissance, refined salt was a delicacy, and its presentation became a sort of medieval arms race. Enter Benvenuto Cellini, famed sculptor, part-time egoist, and full-time bringer of bling. Cellini created a gold and enamel salt cellar for King Francis I of France that defies all conventional logic. It featured Neptune reclining to represent the sea, and a nymph representing the earth, each lounging dramatically beside a tiny container meant to hold a pinch of salt. It was the kind of dish you put on the table, not so people could use it, but so they could bow to it. After all, what's the point of dinner if you're not incidentally reminding your guests that you can afford an edible mineral that once doubled as currency, and a sculpture so valuable it requires its own footman and 6 guards? But don't worry, our wander through spare-no-expense history gets dreamier, because there was no expense too small to be gilded. Take, for example, ostrich eggs. They weren't eaten, no. These eggs turned into bejeweled objets d'art, sometimes trimmed in gold and pinned atop tiny thrones of velvet. Why? Because an ostrich egg imported from Africa screamed, "I'm worldlier than thou." There's nothing quite like turning someone else's breakfast into a conversation piece atop your Duchess-sized mantle. And then, of course, there were the private menageries. Having a pet lapdog was basic, a pet monkey, très chic. But you hadn't really entered the upper crust until your backyard featured a peacock, a pair of lions, and an Asian elephant that scared the bishop during garden parties. In 1514, Pope Leo X, a Medici of course, received a white elephant named Hanno from the King of Portugal. Hanno lived in the Vatican and had his own custom-built stable with allegorical frescoes. He was fed rosewater-scented pastries and walked before processions like a four-legged endorsement deal. Frankly, Hanno had a better skincare regimen than most of us. And when Hanno died, that same Pope had Raphael, the Raphael, create a commemorative fresco for an elephant. Because if you're going to mourn an animal, why not have one of the greatest painters of all time do the honors? Such was the logic at the intersection of divine authority and reckless gold coin management. Sleepy irony wrapped in brocade, isn't it? And while medieval cardinals and Renaissance princes debated which saint might best protect their imported lap giraffes, a new class of collectors was quietly emerging. People whose grand purchases had nothing to do with animals or allegories, but with something far more peculiar: time. But before we drift into that temporal curiosity, let's rest here a while. Among glittering salt thrones, reclining deities, and gold-trimmed ostrich eggs, our dreams take on a certain shimmer. Let's close our eyes and listen for the gentle footsteps of those who tried dearly to buy a moment and hold it forever. In the gilded cradle of the Italian Renaissance, where money didn't just talk, it sang madrigals, commissioned cathedrals, and sometimes built entire cities out of marble. A peculiar trend emerged among the continent's most golden-pocketed elite, buying worlds that didn't exist yet. Well, not in the typical sense. You see, there comes a point, somewhere between the fourth villa and the fifth gilded codpiece, when even the richest merchant bankers and popes felt a bit bored. Tired, perhaps, of the same old frescoed walls and gold-studded mules. So they did what any sleep-deprived, art-obsessed, money-saturated noble would do. They created imaginary heavens, fantastical utopias, and then, because restraining oneself wasn't fashionable, they paid actual architects, artists, philosophers, and astrologers to render those visions in stone and ink, herb gardens and hydraulics. Take Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, whose nose was famously sliced to accommodate a wider field of vision in his portraits. He was the kind of man who'd flip through translations of Greek philosophy like bedtime stories before commissioning a private study that was less room and more intellectual spaceship. Lined with inlaid intarsia illusions, wooden panels so finely cut and assembled they seemed to be three-dimensional cabinets holding imaginary books. It was a sanctuary for contemplation. Federico didn't just ponder painted heavens, he paid florins to recreate one, down to the celestial orrery turning silently above his writing desk. Meanwhile, over in Mantua, Isabella d'Este casually invented designer spirituality. A noblewoman with taste so refined it made popes nervous. She curated her studiolo. Think, personal Pinterest board made physical. Only it cost as much as a mid-sized nation. There were paintings by Mantegna and Perugino, statues of classical gods doing curiously coy things, and a library where books whispered secrets in candlelit Latin. Her treasures weren't just about value. They were conversation pieces with the muses themselves, if the muses had price tags and delivery fees. And then there were the gardens. Oh, the gardens. If you ever find yourself drifting through dreams and end up in 16th century Italy, don't be surprised to stumble upon a fountain shaped like a sea monster vomiting water into a marble basin shaped like a nymph's day bath. It's just the Villa d'Este in Tivoli casually showing off, created by Cardinal Ippolito II d'Este, a man with minimal job stress and maximal disposable income. The gardens were less about growing herbs and more about growing ore. He brought in engineers to choreograph water shows centuries before Las Vegas thought of it. Water organs, hydraulic statues, and fountains that played music flooded the estate. Literally. Guests sometimes had their ankles dampened by sudden jets from the ground, a little prank from the pigeons of papal privilege. When you've got Vatican, it's serious. Connections and money to blow. Surprise water-spitting dragons are just part of the ambience. But even these marvels pale when compared to Sabbionetta, a city built from scratch by Vespasiano Gonzaga, who woke up one morning and decided the only suitable retirement plan was to become the architect of his own ideal universe. He didn't merely upgrade a town. No, that would have been thrifty. He hired mathematicians and humanist thinkers to design the perfect city, complete with right-angled streets, a harmonious central square, and an opera house for about 12 people. It was as if SimCity had been invented 400 years early, but with fewer parking lots and much more stucco. The lesson, whispered through ivy-covered statues and centuries-old manuscripts, is this. When money really doesn't matter, time stops obeying the ordinary rules. The super-rich started buying pasts they never lived in, futures they'd only imagined, and heavens they hoped would impress the neighbors. And yet, not all their curiosities stayed rooted in the Renaissance. Some particularly restless minds would soon step away from Italy's golden glow, looking not to fictional utopias or mythic gardens, but toward places where the food could feed armies, and the tableware cost more than a ship. A gentle clatter of silver and porcelain awaits. By the 17th century, having a hefty coin purse was no longer enough. The super-rich had mastered castles, conquered wardrobes stitched with gold thread, and gorged on banquets where even the chickens were stuffed with more chickens. So naturally, the only logical next splurge was a bit of tree-based eternal glory. Enter the utterly bonkers world of aristocratic garden design. Yes, gardens. Not mere patches of green, but sweeping horticultural symphonies where each bush was a violin, pruned, coiffed, and occasionally coerced into looking like your cousin Damien, but only more noble. We begin in France, where Louis XIV, a man whose sun-like ego could outshine the actual sun, decided that his garden at Versailles must not simply be beautiful. No, it must be a manifestation of cosmic order itself. The rich didn't just want Eden, they wanted Eden to take marching orders. So Louis hired landscape architect André Le Nôtre, a man who must have looked at trees the way a hairstylist looks at damp bangs. Le Nôtre carved out symmetrical lawns, mirror-like canals, and groves so meticulously organized that even a hedge maze bowed politely before entering. The trick was to tame nature so fiercely it started behaving like marble. Trees lined up in military precision, fountains squirted in rhythm, like synchronized swimmers auditioning for Apollo. Even the birds probably had to fill out a registration form before landing in the Royal Oaks. And these weren't just pretty strolls with your powdered friends. Oh no. These gardens were theaters of power. Versailles wasn't a place, it was a performance. Louis would host garden parties so elaborate that you needed a full week, a sturdy pair of shoes, and possibly a donkey just to get from the salad course to the dessert fireworks. Meanwhile, over in England, the elite took one look at this botanical discipline and said something along the lines of, charming, but what if our nature looked more natural? Cue the rise of the English landscape garden, where the pigs were allowed to cavort, and the trees, well, they reclined casually like philosophers in a tavern. Leading the charge was Capability Brown, whose first name wasn't Capability, but whose landscaping skills were deemed so competent, the name stuck like a faint compliment from a British uncle. Brown specialized in rolling hills, lazy rivers, and the kind of gentle aesthetic chaos that made it look like the earth had simply happened to arrange itself perfectly during a midday nap. But let's not be fooled. This brand of perfection took a team of hundreds, shovels in the occasional redirected river. The joke, you see, was that the natural look cost more money than the overtly artificial one. Rich patrons paid fortunes just to make it look like they didn't try. Imagine spending 3 years and 50 laborers to construct a rustic waterfall just beyond your fake medieval hermitage. Ah yes, because what's missing from this perfectly sculpted wilderness? Gerald, the designated hermit. Yes, that was a thing. Some wealthy estates hired live-in hermits. These fellows would hole up in grottos, wear bark robes, and deliver cryptic wisdom to passing nobles, usually along the lines of, beware the folly of man, or lunch isn't included, is it? The hermit's main job was to look sufficiently wise and miserable. In one case, an estate owner explicitly advertised for a hermit willing to forgo bathing, trimming his nails, or speaking to anyone for 7 years. Terribly antisocial, but one imagines the squirrels loved him. Meanwhile, Italy had inherited the Renaissance passion for pairing gardens and philosophy. The Villa d'Este near Rome featured fountains that sang, mechanical birds that chirped, and enough marble statuary to assemble your own pantheon. Some of these Italian gardens even included working hydraulic organs. That's right. Imagine walking past a trickling pond only to hear Handel start blasting from a water-powered music box. All of this, of course, was funded by the kinds of fortunes that might include entire colonies, monopolies on nutmeg, or vast tracts of taxed peasants. Gardens weren't just hobbies. They were status symbols, living metaphors, and occasionally outdoor ego shrines too large to prune themselves. And at night, when the torches flickered and the fireflies danced, the aristocrats could admire their profoundly unnatural nature, secure in the knowledge that their money had finally tamed the wilderness into waltzing on command. Just over the next hill, though, where the wind whispered through less manicured leaves, something else was brewing. Something that involved silk, scandal, and an entire society spinning out of control, one designer accessory at a time, in the golden haze of late 18th century France. While revolution simmered like an unattended pot of bouillabaisse, the aristocracy found itself increasingly preoccupied with a pressing philosophical question, namely, where best to position one's indoor canal. Yes, indoor canals. The casual water feature of choice for that rare breed of noble who had already exhausted the novelty of private operas and pet tigers. Take, for example, the Marquise de Pompadour's lesser-known cousin, the Vicomte de Chamboul, a man so wealthy and so bored that he commissioned Venice for his garden. Not Venetian-style gardens, no. Actual Venice, miniaturized, barged in, brick by brick, and pretentiously rearranged into what he called Le Petit Lagoon, with real gondolas, with imported Italian gondoliers who were paid handsomely to hum in French accents. He didn't quite get the canals to work properly, something about the plumbing still being stuck in Italian. But he did host a mock Venetian regatta for his houseplants. The winner every year, a laurel named Bertrand, mysteriously buoyant. In this shimmering age of gilded absurdities, no object was too obscure, no purchase too odd, no whimsy too whimsical. The Rococo elite had long forsaken practical wealth. Now it was about theatrics, and few theatrics were more fashionable than owning an automaton. Automata were mechanical marvels disguised as toys, but often functioning as elaborate metaphors for self-delusion. Clockwork birds that sang real bird songs, mechanical ladies who wrote polite notes in exquisite cursive. One notable machine was a tiny man who performed card tricks with such flair that one duchess reportedly fell in love with him. Her husband grew suspicious, which is awkward when your romantic rival requires daily winding. These intricate devices were the precursors to modern robotics, albeit with more wigs and lace. They were expensive, tress-fragile, and absolutely useless, which made them perfect for nobles looking to display both their wealth and complete disconnection from practical reality. The Marquis de Tralala, for instance. Yes, that was genuinely his nickname, and no, he never walked, but preferred to be rolled, owned a mechanical dining table that rearranged his courses with a series of clock-like arms. He was delighted until the beef à la mode was accidentally sorted under dessert and ejected at speed across a ballroom. The ensuing stain was declared an artistic triumph. Even fashion joined the mechanical movement. There were fans that spat misted lavender when flicked open, and wigs so tall that they required hidden scaffolding, and sometimes pigeons inside. One especially avant-garde duchess wore a gown that included a working birdcage, complete with "And we too love birds," who presumably never signed up for the party. These inventions weren't always successful. A particularly ambitious noble attempted to design a self-writing diary operated by hot wax, feathers, and vanity. It caught fire before it finished Tuesday. But success wasn't the point. No one needed the machines to work, only to exist. The mass of them, the ticking, chiming, whirring symphony of unnecessary mechanisms, it soothed the privileged mind like a lullaby of truly expensive nonsense. This wasn't just Paris. Across the Channel in Britain, the aristocracy was engaging in a similar kind of chaos. Lord Featherstone had a dining room that rotated so that his guests could see all 4 seasons, thanks to an outdoor panorama painted on 4 massive curved walls and a suspicious surplus of pigeons. But back in France, perhaps the greatest marvel of excess during this time belonged to a certain countess who remained nameless in polite society, mostly due to the scandal involving a yodeling automaton and a bishop. She commissioned an exact replica of Versailles' Hall of Mirrors, built underground beneath her chicken coop. No one knows why. Chickens, it seems, didn't appreciate Baroque splendor. By now, the line between wealth and absurdity had not only been crossed, it had been tap-danced upon by powdered wigs. And yet, as candlelight flickered against crystal chandeliers in politely nonsensical rooms filled with mechanical dogs and harmony-belching violas, the dream felt intact. After all, when money means nothing, the imagination drifts far afield, past logic, beyond comfort, straight into the realm of silk-lined delusion. But even the most well-oiled absurdities eventually creak. And as another sun set over gilded rooftops and indoor moats, a new appetite began to stir. Something even more precious than animatronic birds or imported gondoliers. Privacy. A retreat, perhaps. Somewhere unimaginable. Somewhere like underground. It was the spring of 1715, and Paris smelled faintly of horse hooves, hot bread, and the powdered dreams of its aristocracy. This, you'll find, was an era when the rich were no longer content with just silk undergarments and golden chamber pots. They wanted spectacle. And so, rich Parisians began throwing dinner parties not only to impress their guests, but to out-bazaar each other in ways that might mildly confuse a time traveler and deeply concern a modern event planner. Imagine being invited to a nobleman's banquet, only to discover the evening's entertainment is not a string quartet, but a flock of peacocks dyed lilac strutting through the drawing room, each one named after a Greek god, naturally. These were not illusions of grandeur. They were full costumed, feathered, perfumed hallucinations of affluence, and no one embodied this better than one notorious host, the Marquis de Sade's much milder cousin, the Marquis de Louvois. Louvois had once dined atop a hot air balloon tethered above his garden. Not content with simply seeing his estate from above, he wanted to eat foie gras while floating gently over it. Of course, the balloon remained stationary to avoid any sudden gusts sending pâté into someone's wig, but the spectacle tickled his guests greatly. It also mildly alarmed the goats in the meadow below, who had not, until that moment, seen dinnerware suspended from the sky. This was a time when great wealth was like a child with a paintbrush, messy, unfiltered, and sometimes inexplicably fixated on ostrich eggs gilded in gold. Owning rare animals was a common flex, but truly elite collectors aimed for combinations so exotic they bordered on mythological. One count kept a tame panther that drank from a crystal chalice and wore a silk ribbon on Tuesdays. Naturally Tuesdays, as Thursdays were reserved for the talking parrot who recited Voltaire. Speaking of theatrical flair, have you ever eaten soup made from snow collected atop the Alps? Neither have I, but the Duc d'Orléans proudly served it. He paid a group of Sherpas about 12 times their annual income to retrieve pristine drifts, melt them carefully, refreeze the water into artisanal flakes, and then serve them to guests in gold leaf bowls shaped like cherubs. The flavor was described in his diary as ethereal, like kissing a cloud with a faint eau de glacier. It was also completely tasteless, but that was rather beside the point. One enterprising duchess hosted a dinner wherein every dish was the same color as her dress. Guests arrived to discover a banquet painted entirely in violet hues. Lavender soup, eggplant soufflé, candied violets folded with cream, and, less successfully, a smoked trout, dyed an unnatural lilac that left guests politely suppressing horror behind their embroidered fans. Fashion, after all, was meant to inspire, not necessarily to marinate. The wealthy elite of this period also had a taste for impersonating the common folk, but only in controlled, picturesque environments where the pigs were scrubbed clean and the hay smelled faintly of Chanel. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette was famously gifted an entire peasant village where she could cosplay as a milkmaid while sipping champagne and being serenaded by court musicians dressed as shepherds. There were golden buckets for milking her perfumed cows, and fresh roses scattered on the cobblestones to preserve the illusion that rural life was, in fact, just a stroll through a romantic painting. Time and again, the ultra-rich pursued novelty as if their bedrooms had run out of ceilings to gild. Once you've paved your driveway with lapis lazuli and trained your nightingales to trill minuets, the next logical step, apparently, is to host a masquerade ball where everyone dresses as an element. Fire wore sequins, water shimmered in silk, earth had moss stitched into their cuffs, and air, tragically underdressed, was simply invisible. A brilliant idea, until the staff mistook them for no-shows and served their dinner to the peacock instead. It was, in short, a fever dream of opulence, but a very organized one, with place cards written in calligraphy, dipped in caviar ink, and harpsichord arrangements made for 6 hands and a nose flute. Each evening was another chance to prove that not only could money buy anything, it could also buy things no one asked for, needed, or even particularly liked. And yet, amidst all this glittering absurdity, a new fashion began to emerge, one that whispered rather than shouted, that delighted in simplicity, even imperfection. A quiet rebellion of elegance was starting to simmer in salons scented with sandalwood and subtle revolution. While the rest of us fuss over whether a throw pillow matches the couch or whether buying 2 kinds of oat milk is extravagant, there once existed a small, terribly charming class of individuals whose relationship to money was slippery, at best. Picture them, sipping vintage wine from cups made entirely of gemstones and asking earnestly, "But what if we had a clock that told time with perfume?" Because, dear listener, that did happen. Let us drift tonight into the golden haze of the French Rococo era. Somewhere between the final hurrahs of the Sun King and the moment someone remembered that revolutions tend to be fueled by being told to eat cake. In Paris, and more specifically, in the gilded salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, riches didn't buy survival, they bought whimsy. There was, for example, the Marquise de Pompadour, mistress, muse, and master of turning money into delicate absurdity. She once commissioned a set of porcelain asparagus. They were not candlesticks or serving spoons or even napkin holders. They were simply asparagus, life-sized, glazed to perfection, dozens of them. Why? Because she liked the look of asparagus in springtime and did not want to wait for seasons. That was just art for art's sake. But then there were clocks. Not ordinary clocks. These were clocks that chimed with music written exclusively for them, or released small puffs of exotic incense at the hour mark, because tracking time really ought to involve a bit of ceremony and scent. The Comte d'Artois had one with mechanical birds that danced every quarter hour. It cost more than most medium-sized palaces, and was wildly inaccurate, but it never failed to impress guests or confuse servants. Of course, when thyme and vegetables had reached their decorative peaks, the bar set even higher. Enter the age of convenience palaces. The Duc d'Orléans, a man who saw no contradiction between great wealth and unrelenting laziness, built a summer retreat that featured a fully artificial stream. It flowed only when he approached, thanks to a hidden system of footmen opening stopcocks in sequence as he walked. Charming, no? Especially when you remember that the whole estate was less than a quarter-mile wide. He could have simply walked to a real stream. But that would have involved stairs. And talking of stairs, a woman of serious wealth and equally serious dramatic flair, the Princesse de Lamballe, dear friend to Marie Antoinette, commissioned a staircase that folded away into the wall with a button. Yes, a button. Because she declared, with aplomb, that she did not want to look at stairs when one is not using them. Luxury wasn't just about things, though. It was about experiences. There were parties where snowfall was manufactured indoors, out of crushed alabaster and cooled perfumes. Entire forest scenes were imported into dining halls so that guests might eat oysters in what appeared to be a moonlit grotto. Sometimes these guests dined entirely in silence, attending elaborate, mute banquets, simply because someone thought it an amusing challenge. The rules were few, but they were strict. No talking, no laughing, only dramatic glances, meaningful chewing, and the strategic use of bells to signal approval of the chicken. Now, lest you think this was all isolated to France. Ah, no. Jump across to England, to the height of the Georgian era. Lord Rokeby, a notoriously eccentric nobleman, was so determined to enjoy the relaxing benefits of water that he built a glass house, yes, entirely of glass, over a private bath in his garden. He would stay in the tub for up to 8 hours a day, sipping beef tea, that's broth, not a meat-based smoothie, reading Latin poetry, and insisting he did his best thinking when sloshing. He also refused to trim his beard, which grew so long he became partially waterproof. Imagine that. A man so rich, he casually became his own umbrella. Did he make important decisions while wet? Probably. Were they good? Unclear. But money didn't have to buy practicality. In fact, it almost aggressively didn't. Money bought cucumber rooms, ivory letter openers shaped like Greek gods, shoes so delicate they couldn't be worn, made from thread spun from crushed pearls. The truth was, once the basics were outrun by wealth, what followed often resembled a lucid dream. A beautifully furnished, mildly impractical dream, filled with secret mechanical gardens, heating systems made from lava stones, and books that were never meant to be read, only dusted. And my dear, as the candlelight of this chapter flickers low, a whisper drifts through the silk curtains of history. What might one do when collecting things becomes dull and collecting people becomes the next glamorous hobby? Let's tiptoe toward that idea in the next quiet moment, in the scented hush of Louis XVI's Versailles, where silk rustled like whispers, and the chandeliers didn't just twinkle, but practically performed ballets overhead. There was one thing the very rich loved more than gold-leafed furniture, or wigs so high they brushed the heavens. They adored miniatures. No, not the hobby shop sort of miniatures, and not even the kind you'd find in a dollhouse, though we'll get to dollhouses in a moment. No, this was the golden age of commissioned miniature portraits, often painted on ivory, worn as lockets near the heart, or tucked into ornate snuff boxes by people who desperately wanted to be remembered as adorably regal. Because what's more romantic than gifting your beloved a near-eye-straining, thumb-sized rendering of your somber aristocratic frown? And if it seems curious that these pint-sized portraits were so coveted, consider that they were the selfie equivalents of the 18th century, just with more ruffles. Nobles would send them across Europe to seal marriages or diplomatic flattery, and, in some cases, political blackmail. Here's my finely painted likeness, darling. I trust you won't forget my generous dowry, nor tell anyone how I actually look in candlelight. Among the most lavish miniature collections belong to Catherine the Great of Russia, a woman who, to no one's surprise, managed to seek a turn art collecting into an extreme sport. She didn't need an excuse to build entire palaces for storing her art. She simply did. In fact, her hermitage, not yet the museum it would become, was part palace, part private aesthetic fortress. Within its gilded walls, she hoarded enough miniatures to wallpaper a modest cottage, or perhaps just decorate one of her lesser drawing rooms. But let's not stop with flat portraits. Oh no. the truly extravagant moved on to an oddly specific obsession: mechanical miniatures. These were tiny automata, clockwork marvels, the ancestors of your old wind-up toys, only far more intricate and, thanks to Swiss and French masters of delicate gear fiddling, vastly more expensive. One particularly stunning example? The dulcimer player, created around the 1770s, a small bronze automaton in the form of a powdered sugar-sweet lady, gently playing a dulcimer while turning her head in hauntingly lifelike movements. She didn't just go tick-tick, she emoted. And lucky were those invited to after-dinner salons where she made an appearance, stealing the show from live musicians who probably muttered something like, "Well, that's my career, ruined by a snobbish music box." These luxurious toys didn't merely sit on shelves, they performed. Guests gathered round to marvel with feigned sophistication while silently wondering if they could afford one. Spoiler alert, probably not, unless your idea of affordability involved shutting down a village or levying a spontaneous aristocratic tax on the peasants. Speaking of villages, there was, in the late 18th century, a curious real-size miniature of sorts created by none other than Marie Antoinette. Perched among the gilded excess of Versailles lies the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet. Fed up with court life, and possibly suffering from too much champagne syndrome, Marie commissioned an idealized peasant village on the palace grounds. There, she and her friends would dress up in pastoral outfits, custom-made silk shepherdess gowns, of course, and frolic as pretend milkmaids. This was less experiencing rustic charm and more playing Little House on the Champagne Prairie. And yet, the Hameau was meticulously built with stocked gardens, functioning dairies, and actual livestock, though historians are still unsure whether the Queen herself ever did any honest milking. "Mais no," you can almost hear her whispering. That's what the well-perfumed farmhands are for. Even more surreal. Foreign dignitaries were walked through it, forced to compliment the Queen on how convincingly she played at poverty. The irony could have ploughed its own fields. Still, the Hameau stands to this day, a dreamy, sugar-dusted reminder of a time when the super-rich could afford to play peasant without encountering mud or consequences. But just as miniatures brought art and whimsy to the idle elite, what happens when the ultra-wealthy decide to dig in, literally, and reshape entire landscapes just to suit their own dreams? It begins with a manicured hedge and ends with a full-blown architectural fantasy. Let's wander into those gardens next, shall we? The French aristocracy of the 18th century had very few problems. One of them, apparently, was a deep and persistent fear of being even slightly inconvenienced by nature. Take, for instance, the Duc de Chartres, cousin to King Louis XVI. He detested the idea of wind, rain, or sunlight touching his noble brow. And so, in a fit of inspiration, and what we can only assume was an endless budget, he ordered the installation of artificial weather in his private garden. Yes, the Duke employed what was then a team of modern geniuses, engineers, landscapers, and an orchestra of human laborers to create wind machines, sunscreens, and even something called mechanical birds that chirped cheerfully, regardless of season or logic. All this, of course, so he could stroll through an eternal spring, no matter what the actual sky above was doing. But the Duke was far from alone in his quest to outwit reality. Across the Channel, in the drawing rooms of Georgian England, fortunes were being poured into tiny things, specifically automata. These mechanical wonders were the iPhones of the Enlightenment, exquisitely engineered birds that sang, dolls that danced, and even a duck. Yes, a duck that could flap its wings, eat actual grain, and supposedly produce realistic, digestive results. Designed by Jacques de Vaucanson, a man who took the phrase attention to detail to its most unnecessary heights, the digesting duck became a sensation. Imagine an entire room of powdered wigs applauding a brass and feathered machine that pooped on cue. Vaucanson, it must be said, did nothing by halves. These lavish curiosities weren't just technology, they were statements. Owning a mechanical caged bird was almost like saying, yes, I too have transcended the petty burdens of biology. But back in France, where the appetites for absurdity burned like 1,000 wax candles, nobles also developed a curious fondness for pretending to be poor. And I promise, that is not a misreading of the word rich. Marie Antoinette herself commissioned an entire fake village on the grounds of Versailles. It was called the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. Picture this: a working dairy, quaint cottages with thatched roofs, goats with personal attendants, and milking stools carved from rare woods. Here, the Queen and her friends would rough it, wearing costly peasant dresses tailored by Parisian designers who presumably had never met an actual peasant. Milk was delicately poured from porcelain jugs. Fresh eggs were hand-delivered by a servant dressed, of course, as a farmer. And the entire experience was so extravagantly curated that one would need a small army of accountants just to manage the fantasy of poverty. It wasn't just Versailles. Across Europe, a new form of noble amusement took root: pastoral roleplay. Lords and ladies would construct entire villages, not to help locals naturally, but to entertain themselves. Georgian visitors to these estates were often treated to scenes where their hosts played at shepherding, weaving, or, if things really got wild, carrying a basket of apples. Meanwhile, the actual laborers lived just beyond the walls. Real hayfields, real blisters. But extravagance always finds a fresh outlet. In the 1700s race to build the most natural, unnatural garden, English nobility began installing ruins. That's right, faux ruins. Carefully constructed crescents of crumbling Roman pillars that had never been Roman nor ruined. The idea was to show one's implicit connection to the grandeur of past civilizations, while also subtly implying, I can afford not just buildings, but buildings meant to look destroyed. One nobleman ordered a Gothic abbey ruin, complete with imaginary tombstones and ancient inscriptions, built from scratch to lend his estate a more romantic air. Because nothing says elegance like a centuries-old tragedy you just finished building last Tuesday. These staged decays became so fashionable that architects specialized in ruin design, a strange job title that, frankly, feels like a metaphor for the entire aristocracy. In arcaded halls and formal gardens, the 1% of yesteryear weren't just spending money, they were reshaping reality to suit whatever whim emerged between champagne and morning rides. Practicality was not the point. Influence was. Delight was. And in a world where need was obsolete, aesthetics became obsession. Next, we drift to another curious corner of historical indulgence, one where the rich sought not just rare items, but the impossible itself. By now, you've learned that history's upper crust had a penchant for splurging on things most of us wouldn't consider even slightly. Secure practical, gold-threaded socks, ostrich-drawn sleds, or a diamond-encrusted toothpick used precisely once before it was gifted to a spaniel. But let us now drift toward the tufts of fragrant lavender and faint echoes of harpsichords, as we turn our attention to one of the oddest obsessions of the fabulously wealthy, collecting human beings. Not in the evil lair sort of way, no. Something altogether stranger. They were building private courts of jesters, philosophers, singers, and yes, occasionally a pet poet or two on retainer. Behold, the luxurious oddity of the ornamental genius. Now, holding smart people captive might sound like the twisted tale of a villain with an overgrown library, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, this was simply called patronage. Except in the hands of the ultra-rich, it became something else. A playhouse of intellect, a collection to rival any gallery of Rembrandts. One could stroll through the salons of a noble estate and stumble upon a wandering mathematician mid-theorem or a composer caught elbow deep in a symphony right next to a buffet table he could never truly afford. Take, for instance, Count Hermann Karl von Keyserling, a Prussian diplomat who suffered from mild insomnia, endless boredom, and, tragically, a surplus of funds. He commissioned none other than Johann Sebastian Bach to compose a harpsichord piece soft enough to lull him to sleep, but musically clever enough to lull him in style. The result? The Goldberg Variations. Yes, this entire masterpiece was inspired by a sleepless aristocrat looking for background music so exquisite it could make his dreams perform pirouettes. Not only that, he asked his personal harpsichordist, young Mr. Goldberg himself, to play it at his bedside whenever the Count woke during the night. Imagine ringing a bell at 3 a.m. and saying, "Goldberg, if you please," then drifting off as one of history's greatest musical works played live next to your pillow. Now, that's what we call a premium sleep playlist. And then there was the Prince of Conti, a French noble with a love for witty banter and brooding intellects. He once kept the philosopher Denis Diderot, yes, the Enlightenment fellow, as a sort of enlightened fixture of his estate. He paid Diderot to attend elaborate dinners and pose pointed questions to guests like some sort of walking Socratic centerpiece. Picture a candelabra, but sarcastic and probably wearing very tight breeches. Diderot was once asked by the prince to write an essay explaining why luxury corrupts the soul, all while living off cake, velvet waistcoats, and the prince's generous allowance. Irony, it seems, was part of the amuse-bouche. Russia, not to be outdone, put its own icy gloved hand into the gentleman genius jar. Catherine the Great had a soft spot for philosophers with sharp tongues and impossible names. She once offered Voltaire an estate and a pension to come live at her court, effectively bribing him with both flattery and furs. Voltaire, ever the savvy flatterer in return, referred to her as the great star of the North and sent her alarmingly long letters that were equal parts compliment and international commentary. She didn't get him to move in, but she did buy his entire library, had it shipped across Europe, and set it up exactly as he had arranged it at home, complete with his reading chair, quill pens, and even a few scandalous coffee stains. She then ordered a wax figure of him made and placed it in the seat, so that when strolling among his books, it felt as though the great man lurked forever in thought. An infinitely reusable Voltaire, paws buttoned by candlelight. This peculiar form of luxury acquisition, intellectual curating, was status as much as sustenance. One did not merely commission art or buy ancient sculptures. No, one housed the mind behind the marvel, like a pet who could recite Virgil or invent celestial mechanics before breakfast. The wealthiest homes weren't just filled with things, they were filled with ideas in evening wear. And all while the poets and painters and thinkers dined away on meat-stuffed pastries and argued about metaphysics under intricately painted ceilings. Not a bad way to earn one's bread and bouillabaisse. So, as the candlelight dims and your dreams begin forming powdered wigs of their own, stretch your slippers across the plush carpet of an imagined parlor, where clever thoughts are currency and insomnia bees you timeless music. Next, we turn toward the curious realm of luxurious failing. For what better indulgence is there than extravagant ruin? On the banks of the Neva River, where the frost gleamed like fallen stars and the sky stretched wide with aristocratic indifference, the Russian Empire once hosted a class of nobles so obscenely wealthy they could have sneezed rubies and not bothered to look for them afterward. And among these sapphire-studded snowflakes was a man who, quite earnestly, purchased a lemon tree not for its fruit, but because he thought it looked melancholy and needed companionship. Let us tiptoe gently now into the winter palace of Count Alexander Stroganov. Yes, the same Stroganov whose beef dish would one day comfort overworked office workers the world over. But before he became a culinary legacy, he was just another bored czarist noble with enough coin to bankroll a minor war or fund a private opera performed entirely by parrots. Only one of those happened. Regretfully, it was the opera. In 1789, Alexander, blessed with a beard that seemed to defy gravity and taste, commissioned an indoor lake. Not a fountain, not a reflective little pond with the odd lily pad. No, a full swan-compatible body of water to be installed inside his drawing room. Its sole purpose? To allow tiny gondolas manned by footmen in silk to deliver cheese plates to guests. This, he deemed, was the most civilized way to serve brie. The weird ceiling, because why stop at water, was painted to resemble shifting constellations. But Stroganoff, who believed the zodiac to be a bit too mainstream, had his own invented star signs. The pickled fish, representing resilience, the hidden purse, fortune, and the dancing cucumber, unknown even to him. And it was not unusual, in the swirling glitter of imperial St. Petersburg, for such extravagance to become a form of polite warfare. You see, Count Stroganoff was in a quiet, velvet-gloved rivalry with the Yusupovs. If you're unfamiliar, the Yusupovs were so rich they had a Fabergé egg that opened up into another, smaller palace with fully functioning heating. In 1792, having grown tired of yelling "checkmate" in 9-hour chess matches against ostriches, a quirk of Count Yusupov's, Stroganoff decided his next purchase needed to be philosophical, so he acquired what was thought to be Aristotle's chamber pot. Or at least that's what the fast-talking Venetian dealer told him. When pressed for provenance paperwork during a rather icy salon gathering, Stroganov simply replied, "It smells quite wise." These were the kinds of things the super-rich bought when money wore no brakes, no limits, no shame. While winters froze rivers solid and peasants tightened belts, they didn't eat because food was, in parts, a seasonal hallucination. The elite brewed jasmine tea in gold samovars shaped like Venus and paid ballerinas to reenact sunrise every morning on command. And yet, ponder this. Amid all the jeweled teeth, indoor archipelagos, and libraries stuffed with books none of them read, but that matched the drapes beautifully, there existed a low, poetic yearning. These purchases, while hilariously unnecessary, were also oddly romantic. As if bored billionaires, surrounded by sables and symphonies, still went searching, not for meaning necessarily, but for novelty dressed up as meaning. A dancing cucumber-shaped star sign, if you will. There's something oddly sleepy about that. Like watching someone spend a fortune trying to recapture their childhood wonder by turning their living room into a snow globe, only with more chandeliers and slightly less glue. Outside the frosted glass, wolves padded quietly through forests of deep time. Empires trembled like tired violins strung too tight, and the sun never really rose. It just sort of shrugged itself over the horizon. But inside, the rich kept buying dreams. Terribly impractical ones. One wonders what became of that lemon tree. Perhaps it bloomed. Or perhaps it withered with existential confusion in a salon echoing with parrot arias. Whatever the case, we leave Count Stroganov sipping ruby-blushed brandy and nodding sagely at the stars he made up himself. And just across a continent, and slightly across the line of good sense, a different tycoon was spending rather more gold than wisdom on a napkin collection that wasn't meant for noses, or mouths, or anything practical at all. But that will float to us soon enough. By the mid-19th century, industrial fortunes were blooming faster than any factory chimney could belch smoke, and the newly minted elite of Europe and America were trapped in a lavish, slightly absurd arms race, the battle over who could spend money in the most gloriously impractical way. It was no longer enough to own land or jewels. No, the new aristocracy wanted something grander, something more chandeliered. Enter the era of gilded everything. If it didn't sparkle, gleam, or risk being blinding in the right afternoon sun, it clearly wasn't expensive enough. But among the dazzling obsessions of the rich, one stands out for its quiet absurdity, the obsession with personal zoos. Yes, full menageries curated not for conservation, not for science, but to impress one's dinner guests with the fine conversational detail of, "That's our zebra. We call him Charles. He fits well with the aesthetic of the billiards room." The owner of perhaps the most legendary of these private zoological oddities was the third Marquis of Hertford, a man whose money could buy basically anything except moderation. The Marquis was part collector, part recluse, and entirely unbothered by the opinions of normal folk. He had a penchant for peacocks, multicolored, neurotic, forever screaming creatures that he allowed to roam freely in his home, Bestwood Lodge, leaving trails of feathers and highly questionable deposits. His guests reportedly stepped carefully, both to preserve their shoes and their dignity. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Rothschilds, Europe's definitive "how rich can one family get" dynasty, weren't about to be outdone. Whether it was the Château de Ferrières or their various other palatial estates, Rothschild gardens were thick with flamingos, monkeys, and in one particularly chaotic experiment, a pair of kangaroos imported at great expense, who immediately refused to behave like dignified residents. See, the real flex wasn't just owning something impossibly exotic, it was being able to afford it not working out. Shipping a giraffe from Sudan to France in the 1860s required enough money, manpower, and risky planning to put small military operations to shame. Yet, if your giraffe developed seasickness halfway through the Mediterranean crossing, well, that was simply the cost of aristocratic whimsy. You couldn't be truly rich unless you could afford absurd failure. This philosophy extended even into aquatic realms. Sir Richard Owen, a naturalist with rather well-to-do friends, once recalled visiting a private English estate with an artificial lake stocked with dolphins. Dolphins, swimming sort of in cold British waters. They did not fare well, poor things. But the family's young heir insisted that marine mammals really brought out the Grecian elements of the fountains. Of course, none of this could compete with Tsar Alexander III of Russia's most opulent indulgence, a solid silver horse trough, crafted not for public admiration, but simply so his royal horses would feel spiritually elevated at snack time. These animal indulgences were not just about owning something exotic, they were acts of architectural theatre. Habitats were designed by the same people who styled ballrooms. There were jungle-themed pavilions, miniature deserts, faux Arctic tundras created just to house a slightly chilled polar bear. Zoos had become a baroque form of mood lighting, but perhaps no tale is quite so gently ridiculous as that of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the so-called Mad King. Among his hobbies, which included building increasingly eccentric castles in the Alps and bankrupting Bavaria in slow motion, Ludwig once commissioned a floating swan-shaped barge designed to transport him across an artificial lake while an orchestra played Wagner from a stone grotto on shore. At some point, he even insisted on dining with his horses. Not near, it's them. With them. They were seated at the table. Yet in the quiet hours, when the guests had gone and the torches dimmed, these extravagances often sat unused and unloved. Many of the animals were left to their ornately decorated fates, tended by bemused staff who had not signed up to babysit ostriches with gout. As the years passed, tastes changed. The pet kangaroos were sent home, the peacocks were politely evicted, and the custom dolphin lakes were drained, leaving behind little more than damp indentations in the grass and rumors about what once swam there. Still, the phase had made its mark. When money meant nothing, a zebra in the drawing room briefly meant everything. As twilight slips further behind jeweled clouds, we descend next into another deeply perplexing realm of absurd wealth, the race to build homes that felt more like temples, cathedrals, and, in at least one case, a flying castle in a corner of 18th century Europe, precisely the place you'd look if you were. In search of velvet wallpaper and armies of powdered footmen, the super-elite upper crust faced a peculiar crisis. They had, quite simply, purchased everything. Their manors were stuffed with silk-lined boxes of things inside other silk-lined boxes. Their walls were groaning with paintings, everything from solemn Madonnas to alarmingly muscular Cupids, and their ceilings weren't ceilings at all, but frescoed heavens full of frolicsome gods doing calisthenics. Gold gilt. Of course. Crystal chandeliers. Naturally. Pet peacocks trained to glare menacingly at guests who dared underdress. Absolutely. And so the question arose, What's left to buy when you've bought the world? Enter the fabulous folly. Now, in today's vernacular, a folly might suggest a small blunder, perhaps wearing socks with sandals or texting your ex during a thunderstorm. But back in the Georgian and Regency periods, a folly was its own strange genre of architecture, a grand, purposeless building plunked into your estate just to prove you could afford to be whimsical, like an imaginary castle made real, or a ruin built brand new. Yes, the rich began commissioning fake ruins. Someone would hand a bag of coins to a stonemason and say, "Darling, I want a broken-down medieval abbey at the east end of my property. Crumble it fetchingly. Give me ivy, melancholy, and a hint of ancestral trauma." Follies were, by their very nature, absurd, perfectly ridiculous, and utterly perfect for bored aristocrats desperate to assert their taste and melancholy refinement. Sir Francis Dashwood, no stranger to eccentricity, erected a neo-classical temple that served mostly as a backdrop for nude parties. Meanwhile, the Marquess of Hertford built a small Roman villa just to house some marble busts and a disgruntled parrot. There were Egyptian pyramids on English soil, mock battlements hiding libraries, and Gothic towers that led precisely nowhere. All because having land to spare meant you could summon fantasy from thin air. If your neighbor had a garden gnome, you countered with the tomb of the philosopher king, ideally with water feature and dramatic lighting at dusk. One of the crown jewels of this craze was the island's most famous folly, the Temple of Ancient Virtue, built just outside London at the Stowe Estate. Designed to resemble a broken relic of classical glory, it waited miserably in the rain, solemnly featuring busts of Socrates, Homer, and other long-dead role models the owner probably couldn't quote directly, but admired at a safe, stony distance. And then there was the ultimate folly: fake hermits. Yes, Victorian landowners, never ones to leave madness underdone, began hiring flesh and blood human beings, often slightly unshaven ones, to act as hermits in residence. These men were expected to live in constructed grottos or tiny huts, dressed like medieval monks. They'd wander the grounds muttering poetic fragments or looking wistfully into middle distance, as if haunted by unspeakable personal allegories. In 1763, one unlucky soul was offered food, shelter, and 700 guineas if he would live in a cave for 7 years without cutting his nails, washing, or uttering a single word. He lasted 3 weeks. Hiring a performance hermit was much like commissioning a garden statue, except warm and slightly petulant if asked to work weekends. Guests were encouraged to stumble upon them serendipitously and react with the appropriate level of spiritual awe. "Ah, what a picturesque philosopher," they'd sigh before returning to the drawing room for syllabub and scandal. All of this, folly towers, ruin chic, domesticated mystics, was the ultimate show and tell for the elite. Not just wealth, but imaginative wealth. The kind of money not spent on more rooms or horses or candlesticks, but on ephemerality. Grandeur with a side of absurdity, a kind of architectural cosplay. Today, many of these follies still dot the countryside, slightly embarrassed by their own theatrical flair, like retired actors in full wig and breeches who forgot to change before going to the shops. But at the time, they were among the highest status symbols available. A broken arch or crumbling turret whispering, "We are so rich. We've built nostalgia itself." And listen closely, because over the next hill, there's something even fancier coming into view. Something rarer than stone temples and sad hermits. A luxury so unnecessary, so wildly decadent, it had to be delivered underwater. As night settled over 19th century Paris and gas lamps cast moon-colored halos across cobblestone streets, a curious sound echoed from the Hôtel de Lausanne, a private mansion tucked along the Ile Saint-Louis. It was the sound of muffled arguing, in Latin. Somewhere inside, amid velvet drapes and lion-footed furniture, 3 noblemen were trying to outbid each other for a spoon. Not just any, Spoon, mind you. This was, according to its proprietor, a direct descendant of Nero's silverware. Did the Roman emperor really use it to stir honey into poisoned tea? That remained delightfully unproven. But provenance mattered far less than the glamour of possibility. Owning it wasn't about cutlery. It was about crafting mythologies to place in one's dining cabinet. We have now arrived at a time in history when the super-rich, having exhausted gold, jewels, and even trained squirrels, yes, that happened, briefly in Bavaria, turned their attentions towards something even more elusive than wealth: owning a story better than yours. The kind of possession that lived not in banks or inventories, but in hushed dinner party tales over oysters and too much absinthe. If you've ever wondered how money bends logic into origami, look no further than Lord Frederick Stanhope's giraffe. In 1827, Stanhope became convinced that in order to be taken seriously in political circles, he needed to introduce something diplomatically tall to his estate. Thus, a young giraffe was shipped at great expense from northern Africa, swaddled in velvet blankets, kept moisturized with Claridge's finest rosewater, and fed only fruits pre-peeled by Oxford botanists. The giraffe was named Percival and became part of Stanhope's campaign strategy. Guests were invited to stroke his neck, while sipping rum punch, of course. Leaflets were printed noting Percival's regal demeanor and long-sighted vision, subtle nods to Stanhope's own alleged qualities. When the giraffe adored standing atop the manor's back terrace, it was spun as a natural symbol of oversight. Did it work? Number. He lost the election. But Percival became something far greater, a talking point. The giraffe was later immortalized in oil on canvas, flanked by neo-Gothic columns and holding a monocle in its mouth, unapologetically symbolic, wildly unnecessary, and rare. Or the oidia, things the upper class prized in complete disregard of practicality. Also prized? Ice. Great hunks of it, shaved from Norwegian lakes and shipped to India before melting slowly in the Bengal sun. In the 1830s, shipping ice became a booming business among the elite. Not content to merely be rich, princes yearned to be whimsically chill, both metaphorically and literally. One Maharaja paid handsomely to have a slushier installed near his elephant paddock. Ice was not only rare, it evaporated in real time, making it a form of luxury with a built-in expiration date. The ultimate flex. But the wealthy didn't stop at temperature. They began purchasing the impossible: Napoleon's allegedly unbroken comb, Marie Antoinette's alleged eyelash sold in a glass vial, or in one baffling case, a tooth supposedly belonging to Plato, mounted on a ring and worn by a Georgian duke who enjoyed showing it off to deeply confused poets at his dinner parties. And then there was Leopold Vandal, a Belgian industrialist with the temperament of a flute solo. He once spent a fortune converting his ballroom into a life-sized Renaissance painting. I mean that quite literally. Guests stepped through hand-painted archways into a room drenched in ceiling frescoes, period music played by invisible musicians hidden behind tapestries, and even the punch was served from goblets shaped like cherubs. When asked by a reporter why he did it, Vandel shrugged and answered, "Because I can." A statement which, while maddening, somehow conveyed the central logic of an elite class, determined to turn reality into a series of commissioned hallucinations. What they wanted, more than wealth, was the unshareable, a sense of, only I have this. A nightingale trained to mimic Chopin, a parcel of land once grazed upon by Aristotle, or at least a goat said, to belong to someone who knew someone who once had a philosopher neighbor. And they chased these oddities with squeals of delight, not because they lacked taste, but because they had exhausted everything else. Normal wasn't just passé, it was peasantry. Rarity became the great toilet brush of status. It didn't need to make sense, it just needed to gleam. And somewhere in between giraffes, antique spoons, and musical poultry, they lost track of the rest of us entirely. But what happens when these extravagant toys go missing? As you drift gently among frescoed ballrooms and ivory soup spoons of imperial questionability, allow your dreams to wander toward missing treasures. secret vaults, and the strange lengths to which one might go to keep or retrieve an object no sane person really needed in the first place. The dainty little feet of a Fabergé elephant tiptoed through the velvet-lined corridors of high society, while its glittering ruby eyes judged everyone with the subtle disdain only a bejeweled paperweight could master. And why not? It had been commissioned by a person who had grown so bored with conventional riches that they sought to immortalize their pet elephant in translucent enamel and 18-karat gold. Such was life for the luxuriously restless at the turn of the 20th century. By 1900, the super-rich had grown weary of merely buying land, lacing their corsets with gold thread, or naming steamships after their scorned lovers. No, now they wanted magic, but not metaphorical magic. Literal, sleight-of-hand style magic. Wealth had ushered in a peculiar affection for illusionists. Take John Neville Maskelyne, for example, a famously mustachioed magician who became a hit in Victorian England. He was regularly summoned to private salons to make ladies' pocket watches vanish and monocles float mid-air. Charming audiences who owned diamond mines but still clapped like children when he pulled rabbits from silk hats. Grand dukes and duchesses, impossibly bored between champagne breakfasts and yawn-worthy masquerades, paid astonishing sums to host Maskelyne's illusions in their homes. Sometimes they requested bespoke illusions tailored to their properties, like making a real peacock disappear from one end of the conservatory and reappear in the drawing room wearing a tiny sapphire tiara. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American industrialists were buying magic of a different kind. In Newport, Rhode Island, where ever so modest summer cottages measured roughly the same square footage as the Roman Colosseum, tycoons began importing not just European furniture, but entire European rooms. Yes, literally. Parquet floors, marble fireplaces, mosaic ceilings and all. Disassembled by specialists, packed in crates, and shipped across oceans to be rebuilt inside American mansions like architectural puzzles. The drawing room from a French chateau here. The dining hall from a medieval abbey there. To some it was preservation. To others, glorified larceny draped in velvet pillars. One steel magnate, whom we shall name Lester, because his real name was something robust and mildly saxophonic, once paid a small king's ransom for a set of 400-year-old stained glass windows from a defunct cloister in Bavaria. When customs officials asked what the cargo was, his valet, with all the casual power of someone who chooses necktie fabrics for a living, replied, "Sunlight filtration." But material things weren't the only curiosities the extravagant pursued. When possessions began to feel passé, the next logical acquisition was time itself. Enter Sir Julian Charles, an eccentric English nobleman who, in 1893, paid to have his hydrangeas shipped from Kent to bloom at the Tahitian estate he had built, a perfect replica of his mother's garden, so that he could have English July and Polynesian December. He had the sun, the sea, and refrigeration. And as strange as it seems, Sir Julian was merely participating in the noble pastime of temporal dislocation. Why follow a calendar when you could buy your own climate? Another socialite, Mrs. Mavis Turnbridge, the widow of a shipping magnate, had her staff adjust all the clocks in her villa forward by 3 hours every March. This wasn't for daylight savings. She simply liked the aesthetic of late afternoon sun while having lunch. Invitations to her galas reminded guests that midnight shall occur at 9 p.m. This confused the orchestra and utterly baffled her cat. But Mavis was happy, and the punch was spectacular. These were the golden decades of purchasing not just what one needed, but what one whimsically desired. A Persian carpet that stretched the length of 7 billiard tables. Why not? Imported air, bottled alpine fragrances for one smoking room. Very fashionable. A miniature fleet of gondolas dredged from Venetian canals and relocated to a purpose-built lagoon in one's backyard. Positively understated. And yet, despite the sparkle and spectacle, there was something strangely soothing about the way the rich settled into their eccentricities. A man in a velvet robe consulting a Parisian falconer for advice on breeding peacocks may sound absurd, but it's also oddly lulling, like watching glitter settle in a snow globe. The quiet hum of machines whirring to cool orchids from Singapore, the slow tick of imported Italian clocks set to imaginary time zones, and the faint aroma of cinnamon-scented candlelight flickering through a 15th century Danish chandelier. It all created a kind of opulent hush. And in the hush, we drift gently toward our next tale, when fortunes, artistry, and a dash of inflated ego collided on canvas, in the endlessly indulgent world of portraiture. In late 17th century France, the aristocracy had a peculiar obsession, getting as far away from reality and commoners as possible, preferably in style and silk slippers. This led to one of the most curious and utterly impractical innovations of the super-rich, the portable garden. Yes, a mobile Eden, wheeled around by footmen in powdered wigs, because the Countess simply must have daisies at her side when strolling indoors. But before we wander too deep into luxury botany, let's set our slippers inside the gilded halls of Versailles, where the morning dew was strategically spritzed by servants and artificial birds chirped, very obligingly, on cue. At court, nobles were often confined to the palace for days, sometimes weeks, as if luxurious captivity would somehow polish their manners and suppress rebellion. One marquis reportedly asked, "If we are prisoners, then why does our jail have 432 mirrors?" A fair question, and the answer may well be boredom. Ornamental, expensive boredom. The kind that eats diamonds for breakfast and insists on tulip petals in its bathwater. Enter the travelling grove. These were miniature landscapes. Think bonsai Versailles, with delicately landscaped hedgerows, tiny fountains, and artisanal gravel, all mounted onto wheeled platforms or carried by servants. You could summon a rococo orchard to your ballroom, or have starlight reflected in a table-sized lake, complete with a lounging water nymph sculpture. Some nobles even commissioned scaled-down labyrinths, so you could get charmingly lost, just long enough to flirt without witnesses. One of the most famous portable gardens belonged to the Duchesse de Chartres, who insisted that no less than 14 orange trees be wheeled in before her luncheon. These were no ordinary trees, grown in imported Venetian soil, pruned by a Dutch specialist, and spritzed daily with Hungarian rosewater. Supposedly, the scent was enough to make passing dukes swoon spontaneously, or at the very least, sneeze politely. Now, this might seem extravagant, and that's because it was. But the pursuit of scenery that moved with you didn't end at potted pines. Wealthy patrons began to commission moving architecture, follies on rails, gazebos that shifted with the sun, and even entire banquet halls built on hidden tracks, so you could dine through a thematic progression of mealscapes, from faux alpine plummet to exotic, questionably accurate oriental breeze. One particularly adventurous earl even arranged for a dinner party to rise slowly over a man-made hill, assisted by a clever system of counterweights and huffing groundskeepers. The guests didn't notice for an entire hour. They were too busy marveling at the shape of their butter. Of course, this wheeled fantasy needed manpower, a lot of it. Beneath every garden on the go was an invisible force of footmen, engineers, and gardeners whose job was to appear non-existent. One memoir from the Time notes, with a weary sigh, that for every noble sitting in a lush indoor orchard, there are 3 men crouching behind a potted laurel, praying the ivy doesn't slide off again. Still, the illusion was the point. Richness wasn't about what you could buy. It was what you could fake so well. Others believed it had always been. It's there. The transient, the artificial, the improbably convenient. These were markers of status. Why settle for nature, red in tooth and claw, when you could have it domesticated, perfumed, and with gold-trimmed roses that matched your soup tureen? By the early 1700s, the mobile Eden fad had outpaced itself. Nobles started tending their own oddities, tulips that danced mechanically, trees with built-in bird cages, and one baroness who reportedly hosted an entire tea party inside a transplanted hedge maze. It rained. Still, she declared it a triumph. Eventually, someone asked the obvious question: why not build the entire palace inside a greenhouse? There was a brief, glorious moment where this dream fluttered through architectural circles like a sugar-crazed hummingbird. Ultimately, it proved too humid for the Whigs. And so it passed. The age of wandering woods and peripatetic petals faded, leaving only scattered poems, a few sketches, and the vague memory of strolling through an opera house beside a mossy topiary giraffe. Still, the longing to make nature portable never quite left the wealthy. Today's designer terrariums and rooftop oases owe much to the eccentric dreams of powdered lords and lace-draped duchesses who once whispered, "What if my garden could come with me?" Next, we drift toward a new kind of luxurious futility, one with feathers, fans, and flamingos that simply refuse to stand still. Somewhere between the flicker of candlelight in a rococo parlor and the idle clink of porcelain cups, the truly stratospheric rich of yesteryear faced a peculiar quandary. Once you'd bought the world, what on earth do you collect next? The answer, at least for a stripe of wealthy eccentrics in 18th and 19th century Europe, turned out to be hair. Yes, actual hair. Locks of it. Snipped, coiled, and sometimes displayed in tiny gilded lockets next to primly painted miniatures, or, if you were feeling extra sentimental or curiously morbid, woven into elaborate, swirling art kept under domed glass. Collecting the hair of the famous, the infamous, or the dearly departed was the kind of solemn flex that said, "Ah, yes, I have money and Napoleon's follicles." Queen Victoria, a woman responsible for more mourning attire than arguably any other monarch, exchanged locks of hair the way modern friends share Instagram handles. Her scrapbooks contained dark bunches tied in silk ribbon, from beloved staff members to foreign royalty. And, of course, Prince Albert's, her most mourned muse, whose moustache may very well have made it into a brooch. Victorian aristocrats whispered over tea not just about fashion or politics, but about who had acquired Byron's curls or Beethoven's unruly strands. One wealthy collector named John Thayer, an American railroad tycoon with a penchant for solemn hobbies, claimed to own a snippet of Abraham Lincoln's hair, snuck from the barber's floor, he said, with exquisite timing. While others collected coins or stamps, Thayer showed dinner guests his precious collection like a man caressing museum-quality lint. In fact, the Gilded Age's elite had a near-medieval relationship with relics, resurrected with capitalist flame, collecting the vestiges of greatness in the form of jawbones, teeth, toenails, or indeed a good sturdy curl from someone thoroughly decomposed, was not only tolerated, it was encouraged by polite society, as long as one did it with the right frame and a properly sanctimonious sigh. Then there were those whose tastes couldn't be satisfied with hair alone. No, some collectors moved on to even more flair, such as moss furniture. During the height of Romanticism, when poets staggered around lakesides, murmuring existential anxieties, the luxury-minded constructed entire outdoor seating arrangements upholstered in living moss. Picture it, chaise lounges made of stone and velvet, detonated with greenery, placed exactly where one could. Gaze tragically at a leaf and think about the futility of empire. Gardening staff were deployed not to clip roses, but to mist a chair. These were not seats one actually meant to sit on. They were more to contemplate upon from a distance, preferably while reading Goethe. Speaking of the poetic and the wealthy, let's not forget the world's quiet obsession with pet diamonds. Not diamonds for humans, no. Diamonds for pets. Princess Victoria of Prussia reportedly commissioned a set of lapel jewels for her Brussels Griffon, Louis, who had his own tailored waistcoats and a sapphire collar, allegedly worth the GDP of a small duchy. Half lapdog, half jewelry model, Louis was known to nap atop velvet cushions in drawing rooms while nobility peered through monocles, quietly wondering if they, too, should invest in a brooch for their tortoiseshell cat. This extravagance extended naturally to taxidermy. Not just any taxidermy, but emotionally fraught taxidermy. Some aristocrats lovingly freeze-dried their pets in lifelike poses, reading newspapers, sipping imaginary tea, or perched majestically atop faux gilded thrones. These were not crude cabin trophies. They were love letters to bygone fluff. Queen Victoria herself kept several of her Pomeranians preserved inside display cases, their glassy eyes appearing to judge you from across the room, possibly because they could smell your lack of inheritance. Yet even such surreal indulgences cannot rival the most beguiling of all once-you-had-it-all purchases, entire villages. Yes. When Britain's magnates grew weary of collecting humans by proximity, they turned to more permanent acquisitions. Some would purchase actual villages, evict the peasants, and remodel the entire hamlet in an aesthetic of their personal choosing, often based on how adorable they imagined Switzerland was. Artificial alpine peaks, cuckoo clocks, and forced cheerful cows would be brought in. All of it to say, here is my arsey privately owned approximation of whimsy. As the candles burn lower on these distant extravagances, and we sink deeper into our pillows, you might wonder where fantasy ends and fiscal irresponsibility begins. But for the ultra-wealthy, who'd already bought the moon in metaphor, even the absurd had a cozy sort of logic. And just beyond the gates of these made-up hamlets and sentimental hordes of Victorian follicles, well, another exquisite indulgence awaits. Let's wander gently toward it, shall we? By the time the 18th century was fluffing its powdered wig for the final act, Europe's wealthiest aristocrats had wandered past the usual excesses of palaces, jewels, and embroidered dogs. Gold-plated ceilings, yawn, goblets carved from emeralds, last season's peasant repellent. To remain dazzling, one had to craft eccentricity from the raw ores of sheer unchecked wealth. One had to be strange on purpose. Consider the curious case of Countess Jeanne de la Rue d'Argent, French noblewoman with a passion for importing complete weather systems. She once paid a bracing sum to have the damp, brooding fog of London bottled and shipped to her chateau every Thursday. Never mind the labor involved, teams of servants trained in fine mist containment. She believed the melancholic humidity lent her tulips emotional depth, which is, of course, exactly what tulips had been missing all along. An artistically tortured backstory. And she wasn't alone. In Georgian England, a mysterious baron, he refused to be called anything as pedestrian as George Smith, commissioned a troupe of footmen to act as woodland hermits. Yes, hired hermits. Actual humans dressed like characters from a mossy novel, paid to live mute and unwashed in artificial grottos on his estate. They were not to speak, not to bathe, and most importantly, never ever to smile. Nothing says, I have more guineas than gods, like a personal collection of decorative introverts. While the truly rich were busy seeding their gardens with humans, the wealthiest of Venice had found a different outlet. Enter glass. But not just any glass. No, this was Murano glass, the spiritual love child of alchemy and opera. Entire chandeliers were sculpted to resemble blooming hydrangeas, with hundreds of pieces so delicate one could slice time itself just by looking at them. Some families competed to have glass so clear, even ghosts would bump into it. Others preferred the more mischievous route, installing mirrors in such disorienting places that guests would regularly apologize to themselves. But perhaps our most ambitious example of money makes weird lies with Prince Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig, bless him, had the artist's heart and the budget of an oil dynasty. Convinced that reality simply lacked the necessary flair, he went about constructing castles as if designing the dream sequences of a caffeinated fairy tale. Neuschwanstein Castle, dripping in spires, curves, and uncrossable staircases, was essentially his fan letter to composer Richard Wagner. Think of it, a musical crush made permanent in stone, complete with a private man-made cave. Yes, the man installed an artificial grotto in his own castle. For ambience, obviously. Whether it was grotto lounging or hermit hiring, these were not acts of practical investment. No one expected a return on funding a climate import business or raising trained moody monks for the backyard. These purchases were acts of performance. Public theatre conveyed in shrubbery, architecture, and oddly damp tulips. And then, just when you begin to think that absurdity had reached its cozy conclusion, along trots the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, to those brave enough to use a nickname in imperial circles. A renowned beauty, Sisi took self-care to almost Olympic levels. Her hair alone required 3 hours of daily grooming, attended by a personal stylist who had to wear white gloves at all times. A misplaced fingerprint could trigger regal dismay. No one wants a smudge in their legacy after all. She also traveled with her own custom-made gymnasium, wielded raw veal as a facial treatment, don't ask, and kept a strict diet that can only be described as ethereal. When not fasting, she preferred broth so light it practically hovered. If money couldn't buy happiness, it could, at the very least, buy a physiognomy so well preserved that one could pass for a poem. But beneath all of this, beneath the fog shipments, the artificially silent hermits, the crystal flowers and subterranean ballroom stalactites, lay something beautifully human: play. A childlike desire to dazzle, to dream, to make the mundane warp and ripple under the heat of a powerful imagination, and an absolutely bottomless coin purse. So next time your ceiling drips water instead of opulence, don't despair. Not everyone has a castle in tribute to opera or a weather subscription, but we all, in our own quiet ways, long to turn reality just a little more theatrical. And as our velvet curtain draws closer to the final act in this parade of peculiar luxuries, we drift toward a tale even grander, one where wealth met whimsy on the high seas and tried to outswim both time and taste. And so, we arrive at the twilight of opulence, where wealth outgrew its own reflection and began to wander, like a silk-robed aristocrat in monogrammed slippers, through the echoing halls of extravagance, utterly confused about what to buy next. Let us now stroll, quietly, velvet-slippered, into the not-so-well-lit room of the truly eccentric purchases made by the very, very rich, once ordinary riches became dreadfully dull. Take, for instance, the curious case of the Maharaja of Alwar in the 1920s, who, during a visit to London, encountered a Rolls-Royce dealership. Dressed in understated local attire rather than royal regalia, he was famously snubbed by the staff who, believing him to be an unserious browser, and nothing stings quite like being called a browser, refused him a test drive. Naturally, the Maharaja did what any mildly inconvenienced billionaire monarch might do. He returned the next day in full imperial armor, purchased every single Rolls-Royce in the showroom, and had them shipped to India to be used as garbage collection vehicles. Few revenge plots have rolled quite so luxuriously through the streets. But even that tale smells modest next to how Roman Emperor Elagabalus handled the burden of boredom and the colossal privilege of empire. Elagabalus, whose approach to leadership can best be described as chaotic maximalism, once invited dinner guests to a feast where the ceiling collapsed, gracefully, of course, raining down not plaster, but hundreds of pounds of rose petals. It's said some guests may have temporarily suffocated under the fragrant deluge, though historians remain divided on whether that was intentional. He also, reportedly, released wild animals into the palace during meals to shake things up. Nothing says Wednesday supper like a lion padding between the soup and the second course. But no discussion of eccentric wealth is complete without Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, the Night King, or, as his budget advisor probably called him, my personal nightmare. Ludwig spent staggering sums building fantasy castles, most notably the iconic Neuschwanstein, which looks like what happens when a child redecorates a medieval fortress after binge-reading fairy tales and drinking one too many cups of hot cocoa. Ludwig so loved the theatre that he built stages, actual stages, in his palaces where professional opera singers would perform Wagner for an audience of one. Him. Sometimes he'd watch in full costume. Sometimes he'd arrive late, to his own show. By this point, wealth had become less about owning things and more about editing reality. Rich men turned coal into diamonds, yes, but some preferred to turn dinner into performance art. Some preferred to purchase islands, not for their beauty, but simply to rename them after themselves. That 19th century Hawaiian landowners once offered to sell an island to Scottish aristocrat Lord Abernethy, who, somewhat gobsmacked, declined, not because of the price, but because it didn't have quite the right vibes. Even the estates, those stately homes with their glorious stone facades and rooms exclusively for discussing the weather, became stages for excess. Enter Lady Sybil Colfax, who, in the 1920s, began employing trained footmen not just to serve, but to stand absolutely still in different doorways, purely for aesthetics. Guests thought they had wandered into a museum of powdered wigs. One footman's job, for an entire evening, was to hold a silver tray bearing a single cucumber sandwich. I imagine he still dreams of that sandwich. And yet, buried under the silks, the marbles, the custom-built Turkish baths imported, brick by brick from Istanbul to Dorset, it seems some of the super-rich weren't simply spending to show off. They were casting their nets into the sea of reality, trying to catch a feeling. Wonder, grandeur, control. Even a whisper of immortality. Because when everything becomes possible, the only thing left to chase is meaning. Or at least, a golden bathtub shaped like a swan. So now, dear listener, as the chandeliers in your mind begin to dim and the ghostly strains of a private opera fade into the soft click of an antique pocket watch, let the velvet curtains of your imagination draw closed for the night. You've wandered through gilded halls, swum in marble fountains, and just perhaps held for a moment what it was like to live in a world where reality itself was just another item on the shopping list. Sleep now, with visions of jeweled typewriters and diamond-studded onion holders drifting serenely through your dreams. Where the rich once bought the impossible, you now carry the most priceless luxury of all, the quiet hush of a well-earned rest.